देख बिना ब्रेक।
Download Tak app.
There was a time when the India growth story was pulling up the world economy. The opposite now seems to be happening, at least for this year. The IMF has cut its global forecast, lowering the India growth forecast as well. Joining us to talk about the current situation and the road ahead is Geeta Gopinath, Chief Economist at the International Monetary Fund. Thank you very much, Geeta, for joining us. I want to start by understanding from you the extent to which you think and the IMF believes that the slowdown in India is currently lowering the overall global economic.
So we've projected growth at 2.9% for 2019 and 3.3% for 2020. That's 0.1 percentage point lower compared to October. And the vast majority of that comes from our downgrade for India, which was quite significant for both years.
So how much of the overall global economic growth forecast that's been lowered has been lowered on account of the India story slowing?
I mean, if you just do the simple calculation, it would be over 80%.
Wow, that's quite significant. I want to understand from you, what is your road ahead? Because in the report that you put out just now, you're saying that the India growth story will be at 4.8%, which is substantially lower than your original estimates. When we spoke last year, the IMF was far more bullish. What, according to you, led to such a significant revision?
So the first 2 quarters of fiscal year 2019-20 came in weaker than we had projected, which is why we had this substantial downgrade. I think the one sector where we are seeing the most stress is in the financial sector, the non-bank financial corporations. We've seen a sharp decline in credit growth and a weakness in business sentiment. And that has led to the revised numbers that we have for India now.
What's your outlook going forward? Do you believe the bottom has reached and from here we'll see a pickup, because no one quite seems to be certain about where the bottom really is?
So we have India recovering. So we have India at 4.8% for 2019, but then going up to 5.8% in 2020. So we have a significant recovery coming in the next fiscal year. There's a fair amount of monetary stimulus in the system. The corporate tax cuts are there. And there have been these programs for transfers to the rural sector. These should help with the recovery in growth.
What are you making of the policy measures the government has rolled out so far? There have been some reports, most notably from Arvind Subramaniam, which said that, while of course land and labor are important reforms, given the current situation, that's not necessarily what will provide the stimulus. In the way that you see it and the IMF sees it, what's the kind of stimulus that you think that the Indian policymakers should really be looking at?
I think the major issue to address is this weakness in credit growth that I mentioned. And so policies that can, resuscitate credit growth, but at the same time one has to make sure that you don't create another non-performing asset problem. I think that's the first step. So it could be quicker recapitalization of banks. I think that would be an important area. But there's also has to be important governance reforms. Again, like I said, you don't want down the road to be another whole set of issues with non-performing assets. So governance reforms are also important. And besides that, there is monetary stimulus in the system and the corporate tax cuts. I mean, these are forces that we project will help India go back up to 5.8%.
When the world looks at India, the current protests that we've seen around the Citizenship Amendment Act and the NRC, does that in any way impact how India is viewed by the world?
Rahul, I don't have anything specific on that particular issue at this point. I can flag more globally that there have been issues of social unrest in parts of the world. I mean, for instance, in Chile, and that affected Chile's growth rate quite significantly. Similarly in Hong Kong, and that affected Hong Kong's growth rates. I mean, social unrest has actually gone up quite a bit in 2019 in many parts of the world. And so it's important to keep in mind that has consequences for the countries in which this happens.
Given the fact that President Trump and the Chinese president are on the verge of signing some kind of a trade deal, there's also talk of the American president coming to India and there being a mini trade deal. Do you think that the worst of the trade wars are now behind us, or do you think this is just a hiatus before the battle begins again?
I mean, it certainly is better than it was in October. In October, we were worried about these risks escalating and growth slowing even faster. Compared to that, we're seeing signs of stabilization, and the US-China Phase 1 deal that was recently announced certainly helps with stabilizing the outlook. I mean, that said, we have to see what comes next. There are still very high tariffs that have not all been rolled back. Trade tensions could escalate between the US and the European Union. The US-China trade tensions could reemerge. So I don't think we are out of the woods here, but there is certainly some welcome decline in trade uncertainty relative to October.
So this is also an opportunity where a lot of international companies, Western companies especially, are looking to move some part of their manufacturing out of China. And because global value chains are being reordered, it's an opportunity for India, which so far hasn't benefited very much. A lot of that has gone to Vietnam, has gone to countries even like Bangladesh, but not so much to India. Why is that the case? What should India be doing to fix that?
So yes, we are seeing movements in global supply chains. I mean, even in the absence of trade tensions, because of cost of production going up in China, there's a appetite to look outside for other places. And India clearly, it would be a very good boost to the economy if it could be a part of the supply chains. But that said, I mean, that requires the kinds of harder reforms, the land reforms and the labor reforms that will be needed to make India a lot more competitive in terms of just-in-time delivery of products. You need better transportation from factories to ports. I mean, all of those kind of infrastructural developments that would be needed to get India into the global supply chain much more tightly.
So is the IMF pushing a very strong government with a big mandate to try and drive towards more land and labor reforms, making the point that this is the opportunity because you've got the numbers to democratically push this through?
I mean, the IMF has, I think, for now many years flagged reforms in these areas as being very important for structural growth in India. I believe the government is also aware of this. There is a desire to increase exports from India, but that will require taking action on these fronts.
You spoke of a massive slowdown in credit, and the rate of growth of credit is now down to a multi-decade low. Why do you think that's the case? There's so many different theories, part of it to do with risk aversion, part of it to do with fear, paranoia, uncertainty about the future. How do you view this lack of interest of Indian businesses, especially in wanting to invest in the India?
So there have been now a few years of the issue of non-performing assets in the banking sector. But one event that triggered and kind of escalated the problem was what happened in 2018 with the failure of one important non-bank financial corporation. So with that, there has been a seizure in lending to the other NBFCs, and that has then fed into weaker credit growth towards consumers and to firms. In addition to that, of course, an important reform that was put in place was the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Whenever a new reform is put in place, sometimes there are transitional issues to deal with. How exactly would your NPAs be resolved? Who can bid for it? Now there is more clarity on that front too. So there's an interim period where looks like there's more risk aversion in lending, and that has fed into some decline in business sentiment, and this has generated the weakness that we're seeing.
We're just a few days away from a big union budget in India, and there's been a lot of talk about how the current government and Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman should really forget about the fiscal deficit for the time being, and that's not something the IMF generally tends to like very much, but focus on pumping money into the economy so that there's a stimulus of sorts. Do you think for a country like India, where we are at the economic growth pyramid, this would be the right strategy?
So I'm going to make 2 points here, which is that first, that for India, in the recent years, it has been disciplined on the fiscal front and not let the fiscal deficit blow out of proportion. That, I think, is important for India's growth story. So any package of reforms that is introduced has to signal the commitment to fiscal discipline, at least from a medium-term perspective. It has to be that kind of a package. In terms of the issue that needs to be addressed, I think the weakness in credit growth is the number one issue. But it has to be done carefully because you certainly don't want to end up with another non-performing asset problem in the future by just being indiscriminate in credit creation. So I think it's a bit of a delicate balance that has to be struck, while at the same time signaling, fiscal discipline from a medium-term perspective.
There are many economists who believe that India could be heading towards a recession, Ratin Roy spoke of how, for a country like India, where we are on the development curve, this is already a recession. Others have spoken about how we're heading into a recession. How do you view that?
Well, our numbers certainly do not point to a recession. We have 4.8% for this year, and we have 5.8% for the next fiscal year. So that's certainly not the case. If anything, we're seeing a recovery in India. I think it's important to keep with the reform agenda. I think it's important to fix the problems in the financial sector, with the rural income sector. I think those are issues that have to be dealt with.
Recent reports from the Center for Monitoring of Indian Economy suggest that unemployment is again at a multi-decade low. How do you view the problem of unemployment in this age where we're at the World Economic Forum? The focus is on the fourth industrial revolution, a lot of automation, a lot of artificial intelligence, all of which doesn't necessarily require the kind of human beings who are being trained and passing out of Indian colleges and universities.
So firstly, I think when you talk about the unemployment issues in India, I think we can, even if you set the numbers aside, I think what's clearly true is that people are not in jobs, high value-added jobs, right? I mean, not in high-quality jobs. So, regardless of how you measure things, it is important that the opportunities that are created in India provide high-value jobs, high-quality jobs. And this is quite separate from the fourth industrial revolution or the automation. I mean, we have seen that is clearly something important to pay attention to. But if you look around the world, I mean, we're still not seeing the signs that that's generating some dramatic shifts in employment at this point. So I think in India, these are cyclical issues, some structural, some cyclical, that have to be dealt with, and greater labor market flexibility would be one way of improving the job environment in India.
So the government's come up with 4 mini budgets since the last union budget. What more would you like to see from an IMF perspective to make India a more attractive destination economically?
Well, I think the number one issue to be addressed is with respect to credit in India, and a holistic approach on that front, which involves first, it could involve recapitalization of banks, increase the transmission of monetary policy through the system, because we certainly know there have been lots of rate cuts, but the transfer to the economy has been not one-to-one. There has been some reforms taken on that front. More needs to be done on raising agricultural productivity, I think, as a permanent solution that has to become far more productive than it is right now. It still hires the vast number of people in the country. So there is a lot to be done. There are important issues to be addressed. The goods and services tax, I think that was important reform.
How do you view the GST rollout at this moment? There have been lots of tweaks in GST percentages. What do you think needs to be done at this time to ensure that GST revenue collections actually jump?
So firstly, I just want to point out that among the factors that are weighing on growth in India, we point to regulatory uncertainty, and some of that has to do with rolling out of new policies, including the goods and services tax, because there have been lots of changes in what tax for different products. So certainty on that front would absolutely help. They have to clearly get a wider base, get more revenue collection coming from it. If they can improve make much more clearer what the rules of the game are. If rebates are provided on time, I think these are important steps that need to be taken. Simplification of the tax code is also important. I mean, these kinds of steps should increase revenue mobilization through GST.
There's been a past track record of chief economists at the IMF ending up in policy gigs in India. Is that something you're eyeing in the future as well?
Now, I have a job. I'm not looking for a job at this point. But thank you for suggesting something like this.
Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.